Please be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSC Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Staying Compliant Through the Business Life Cycle, Essential Guide to Entity Compliance and Licensing. My name is Annie Triboletti, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today are Brian Bartnicki and David Jeffries. Brian is the Business License Sales Engineer at the forefront, assisting customers with their industry-specific requirements, which range from research, portfolio management, and renewal services. Brian has worked with CSC for more than a decade, offering his expertise in the field of license compliance. David is a Senior Sales Engineer for Compliance and Governance Services at CSC in the Wilmington, Delaware headquarters office. With CSC for over 12 years, he has significant experience providing training, implementation, and consultative services to clients of CSC Entity Management and consults with those evaluating CSC matter management solutions. And with that, let's welcome Brian and David.
Great. Thank you, Annie. I know we're both excited to be here.
Yes. And I want to start by just giving everyone just a synopsis of who we are here at CSC. We help you in many markets, whether you're in financial markets, global markets, domestic markets here in the United States. We, in some capacity, service over 90% of the Fortune 500. We have over 2,500 employees worldwide. We are a SOC 2 compliant organization. That's a very high world-class security standard. And we've been around since 1899, and I wish I was that old. But anyway, I really want to start by just giving everyone a brief synopsis about CSC, but that's not why we're here today. I'm going to turn it over to David, and David's going to talk about our agenda for the webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as the slide kind of referenced, and as Brian mentioned, CSC does offer a suite of compliance services, global services, UCC, litigation management. Again, we could sort of go on and on about the breadth of CSC's compliance portfolio, but we're really going to take more of a focused view in our webinar today. And so you should be now seeing the agenda in our presentation. We're really going to focus mainly on entity and business license compliance. And so we'll look at some of the kind of day-to-day responsibilities of folks that have that responsibility within their organization, certainly speak to some of the challenges that these requirements bring to clients. We'll talk about some best practices in terms of managing entities and licensing needs, and then we want to really make the focal point, the meat, so to speak, of the presentation, a review of what we're calling the life cycle. So as you're forming entities, sort of going through changes, dissolving, how does that kind of impact your needs from an entity management standpoint? What impact does that have in terms of a licensing requirement as well? And then certainly towards the end of the webinar, we'll have an entire section on how CSC can bring services and technology to assist organizations with these needs.
Wonderful. And I think it would really be important to start with the daily responsibilities that the people on the phone are probably dealing with. There could be forming entities, amending entities, dissolving them. But as David alluded to, we're also going to dive into how that affects your industry-specific licensing. So some of the things you might run into or you might manage are those industry-specific matters. Beyond that, you might be managing your corporate records, whether that be minute books, bylaws, resolutions, and such. But beyond understanding industry-specific requirements, for those of you, whether you're in retail, restaurants, or hospitality, insurance, trades, contracting, you're probably in some capacity also managing these on an ongoing basis and trying to figure out what you need based on your industry.
So with that framework, let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges that organizations face, again, trying to maintain entity and business license compliance. And I think there's maybe a couple of things to drive home with this particular slide. Number one, either of these disciplines by themselves is, again, not simple, right? So if you're a practitioner managing the compliance of your subsidiaries, maybe that's happening at the Secretary of State, maybe you have a global presence and you're managing your compliance in countries around the world. That is one sort of animal to deal with. But then when we talk about licensing, it gets even more complicated. And Brian's going to provide some insight in terms of just the volume of municipalities, et cetera, where licensing requirements exist and the complexity that brings to the table. But then really, we've really thought through this, and I think another key challenge for organizations is the fact that quite often there are different stakeholders within a legal department, or within an organization, I should say, that have this responsibility. And sometimes it's that old adage of, does the left hand know what the right hand is doing? And so, again, we're going to kind of look at this from the lens of maybe a little bit of a disconnect in some cases between the folks that have the entity responsibility versus those that are more tasked with handling the business license requirements.
And so I want to continue just talking about some other challenges that come about when we're dealing with all of the sort of the segregation of responsibilities. A lot of times that results in late penalties, and that could be as a result of falling out of good standing with the Secretary of State. It could be failure to file a local license or an industry-specific license, which can by default result in lawsuits, being served, but even business closure. There's other things that even can happen, such as arrests, depending upon your industry, or inability to sell and make commission on products, such as it is in the insurance world. Or there's just a lot of factors that result when there's lack of that coordination. And that really also goes back to the sense of, are you confident that what you're managing is correct? Is the cleanliness of your data accurate? Do you have a way of really managing it well? And David, you want something you could think about?
Yeah, well, actually, I was hoping that, and I've sort of teased this, but I was hoping that you could speak to that third bullet in a little bit of detail, because this is a little bit mind-boggling to me. I work mainly with folks who deal with the entity compliance, which, again, is typically at a Secretary of State or maybe a different type of registry if we're talking about a global entity. Perhaps you have DBAs that could be at the county level, but there seems to be a sort of a smaller world of places where we need to kind of maintain our compliance, and now this is just sort of exploding into numbers that are, again, a little bit hard to grasp. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so 150,000 authorities, we're not just, as David mentioned, we're not talking about Secretary of State. You have townships, villages, boroughs, school district, city, county. You could have multiple authorities throughout the country, and think about how many states, how many counties there are. There's just alone 35,000 incorporated cities. That doesn't even include other places that aren't. But understanding what's needed on what you're doing and how you're doing it within all these levels of government is something that's just very overwhelming in the licensing market. And the last thing, and David might run into this too on the entity world, is just understanding the budget. We talked about people have different responsibilities, but is that, from a budget internally being managed or being owned by the same department as well?
So certainly we feel there are some considerable challenges that organizations face with maintaining this type of compliance. But now what we want to do is talk a little bit at a high level about some of the best practices, and then certainly later on we'll get into how CSC can assist with these services. But really, again, at a high level, some of the best practices in terms of how to best deal with these challenges would be things like transparency and centralization, which I really see kind of tied at the hip there in terms of having oversight and insight into all of the information relative to your entities, your business licenses that ultimately will impact your good standing and your overall compliance. Security does fall here as the third bullet, but it could easily perhaps be the number one item that we would talk about here. Certainly in 2019, there are headlines nearly every day about organizations that are impacted by bad actors that are hacking into organizations and taking information that is very sensitive. And so again, any sort of solution that you would put in place to deal with these challenges, security really should be at the forefront of the considerations that you have when evaluating a provider or any type of a solution for maintaining your entity and business license compliance. And then again, knowledge is bringing up the rear in this example, but I honestly think that this is sort of paramount. Again, Brian talked about the 150,000 licensing authorities. If I had the responsibility of maintaining a portfolio of licenses, I probably wouldn't even know where to begin, honestly, in terms of what to do, where I have obligations, what I need, what I don't need, etc. And so, again, having a resource or having a place to go for that knowledge, I think, is again paramount in terms of the best practice.
And one thing I just thought about, in David's world, the entity management space, knowledge, some of us might have a great grasp of the knowledge domestically here in the U.S., but there's also this concept of understanding what's needed when you're dealing with all the countries in the world, right? They all have their different requirements. So really having, that best practice of keeping that all together on a world scale is also imperative.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we've talked about the fact that the what I'm calling the core or the meat of the presentation is to take a look at entity compliance, business license responsibility compliance through the lens of what we're calling the compliance lifecycle. And so we have a couple of examples here that we'll go into in a little bit of detail in the slides to come. So we're going to take a look at sort of, starting out, right? We're forming entities, we're maybe, qualifying in new jurisdictions or getting into new locations in another example. And then certainly as a part of the life cycle, there are changes that occur. Maybe you go through a name change or there's officer director changes. What impact might that have? We'll look at another sort of common change that happens to an organization where maybe you're doing mergers of subsidiaries, maybe you go through acquisitions, and then really sort of the last part of the life cycle would be kind of that end state where you're maybe dissolving subsidiaries or closing locations, and what are the kind of the ramifications of that type of an action or a transaction, so to speak, on your business.
So to start, as David alluded to, I think it's fit to pretend that a company just formed. So ABC Inc. or LLC formed, you've registered the entity, you've incorporated it, and maybe you decide now that you want to go in to another jurisdiction. Maybe the legal department instructed you to file and qualify that in 50 states. Maybe it's 10, maybe it's 1. But beyond that, after that's been completed, are you storing those documents? Are you managing them appropriately? Are you creating minute books potentially? But also, depending on your industry, what regulations are pertinent to your business? So for those of you maybe that are in the insurance world, you may not know, or you might not know if you need to get or register your agency with the Department of Insurance. Maybe once you have that, you got to get an individual license in that jurisdiction. For those of you that are opening a restaurant, now that you've qualified or formed your company, now you have to start understanding if you may need, outside cafe licenses or assembly licenses or liquor licenses, right? What is going to be needed as you start your company and as you expand? There's a couple other examples I can think of. For those of you in the trade world, maybe you're bidding on a job and you're going to go into a new jurisdiction. What is it that's applicable for you to do work in that authority? Local licenses, general contractor's license, architects, engineers. These are all things that are a trigger, once you form or start expanding into other jurisdictions.
Absolutely. And so let's take a look at sort of the next event maybe that would occur in the life cycle. So after you form that company or, again, moved into new locations or qualified into new states, the next thing I think that we'll take a look at is the idea that there is some sort of a change, and maybe that could be a name amendment. So, for example, you go through a name change, or perhaps there's a change in kind of the management structure of your organization. And so we'll talk about the impacts of these particular examples. So, on the entity side, the name change is just more data to manage. And so we need to make sure that we have, updated our documentation so that we can formally approve the change of the name. There are documents certainly to file with various secretaries of state or other authorities. We want to make sure that we have a secure place where we can track that documentation. We don't lose sight of the prior name in terms of our record keeping. Now, when we get into officer changes and maybe director changes as well, there are some different impacts, maybe depending on if we're talking about U.S. subsidiaries versus global entities. In the States, there isn't that much in terms of stringent requirements in terms of managing, officer and director data. But ultimately, when you're filing annual reports, this is information that you're going to need access to in a pretty timely fashion because, again, the signers do get included typically in those annual report filings. So that's information that you're going to want to have handy. Now, if we're talking about global subsidiaries and you're going through a director change, now things get even more complicated because typically that is a change that has to be filed with the actual registry, the governing body in that particular country. So again, it creates sort of a greater impact. Something as simple as a director change can be really kind of a monumental undertaking for a lot of organizations where they have entities around the globe that someone might be tied to and they're working with maybe different law firms or trust companies in different places, and it becomes really a complicated effort of coordinating just a simple director change globally. But Brian, I know there's also some examples that you can share of how a name change or an officer change would actually impact people in the business license world as well.
It would. In many industries, when officers are changed, you have to actually report that change because certain owners sometimes even have to have a certain ownership in the company for you to have a certain license in that particular state. If you have many offices and you have multiple local licenses, you need to make sure in some jurisdictions where they require it that you're actually notifying them of that change, because there are individuals of responsibility that need to be listed within that authority. So if that person leaves the organization, you absolutely have to let them know about that.
And then are there, I mean, what could ramifications be if we don't, again, change that person? Is that person on the hook maybe, even though they're not a part of that organization?
They could absolutely be. And there could be indirect lawsuits that come out to that when someone who's no longer with the organization now is listed as an individual responsibility. I know of a situation, and I've told my colleagues this before, that there was a story of a former officer of a company who got pulled over for speeding, but they used to be listed on a license for a particular license, and they were arrested through a warrant, and they ended up countersuing their former employer. So these things really do occur. They seem wild and outlandish, but they are in fact things that can happen. And to that point, now that we've gone through amendments, another step of the life cycle could easily be a merger or an acquisition. So on the entity side, I know David's very familiar with this. You are going to have the actual drafts and the resolutions, the survivor and the non-survivor. You might have sort of new splitting of stocks and things of that nature that come through that. But on the licensing side, sometimes people don't know what they're taking on. So if you acquire an organization, maybe they have 20 locations, you're not sure what you are now responsible for. And we'll get into ways again down the line that we can help, but it's really important that you're able to really capture what those licenses are. You might have to start the research process of doing some due diligence, but it's really imperative that, at least in the life cycle of the industry-specific world, that you really understand that once these changes occur, you really need to trickle down to the smallest levels of government.
And then again, just back on the entity side, in terms of, from my perspective, obvious impacts in terms of mergers and acquisitions, org charts, right? So it is quite common that organizations, for their own purposes or maybe for sharing information with investors, need to be able to create visualization around their structure in terms of which companies own each other. So then that, again, just sort of drives the requirement of, okay, we've done this merger. Like Brian mentioned, there's the survivor, non-survivor. We've done this acquisition. How do these companies now fit, so to speak, into our structure? And what technology maybe do we have to easily create that visualization that has occurred as a result of that change to our structure? And then I guess the last item that we'll talk about in some detail in the life cycle is sort of the end state. Now, certainly some entities live on forever, but it is obviously rather common that at some point entities may dissolve. There could be locations that close. And so, again, there are impacts to both of these worlds. In terms of the entity side, you want to make sure if you're dissolving or withdrawing that you do it properly and you actually do it. And so there was kind of a bit of a, I don't know if it was a headline in the compliance world, but the state of Illinois earlier this year decided to have a tax amnesty program, sort of a get out of jail free, which is very rare essentially for organizations that had allowed their compliance to lapse and maybe, were done doing business in Illinois but hadn't officially done the paperwork. They were accruing late fees and penalties and interest on the fact that they were not officially out of that jurisdiction, which creates any number of legal headaches for an organization. So again, it is a process to go through, and there are ramifications. It's sometimes easier to get into a state than it is perhaps to get out of a state. And so, Brian, if you want to talk about kind of that, maybe that same parallel in the licensing world.
Yeah, in the licensing world, let's say you have a location in Beverly Hills, California. Okay, I'd love to have a location there.
Sounds nice. Yeah, sounds similar than where we are right now.
But I would say if you're in that particular jurisdiction and you fail to close or cancel the license, they're going to consider you doing business. And what's going to happen is you're going to have to pay, even though you're not there, you're going to have to pay late fees based on revenue. Now, the revenue could be zero, but if you just fail to close it out, you're going to get penalties upon penalties. And if you're late on these things, you're going to end up paying, could be an astronomical amount of penalties. So it's important that in all jurisdictions, not just that example, that you truly make sure that you close out the license, because even though you're not there, until you officially do it, they're going to do everything they can to collect as much money as possible. And it's I see you do it, I want to do it as well. There's so many jurisdictions, and Alabama is just a very difficult one that comes up all the time, where every single jurisdiction wants their piece of the pie. They know other jurisdictions are fighting for it, so they're going to start fighting and make it difficult as well.
Right. And so one last comment, and I'm maybe getting a little bit ahead of myself because eventually we're going to get to the whole section of sort of what CSC can bring to the table, but I'm going to do that now anyway. So one of the things that happens when organizations who are not currently using CSC as a registered agent, when they decide to make that transition to CSC, we do what's referred to as a change of agent project, where the organization gives us a list of their subsidiaries. And on really a complementary basis, CSC goes out at the Secretary of State level or other authorities and really gets a full picture of where these companies registered, what is the current status of these companies. And it's honestly common that, oh, I thought we withdrew from that state, but we never really did, or I didn't know that we registered in that state. So there are often surprises that come back as a result of that audit that CSC is able to provide for organizations that are making the transition to CSC. So I figured I'd throw that in here.
So I think now it's important to really talk about how we can help through the life cycle and what our services would entail. But I think it's really important to really start with our sort of hub, which is CSC Navigator. So here at CSC, we've been talking about business licensing and entity management, but our CSC Navigator, which is really our all-encompassing centralized, secure, and transparent platform that David talked about earlier, is really a way that we can both combine technology and service in one place, whether that's for service to process management, your Secretary of State annual filings. We talked about our entity and business license information. Maybe you're managing contracts or trademarks. That could be our matter management piece, and then our global portfolio. So it's important just to know that anything you do in the compliance realm is going to be managed here in our CSC Navigator.
And just maybe one more comment, and Brian sort of alluded to this. We talked about some of the high-level best practices, right? We talked about security, transparency, centralization, and knowledge, and I think they are all very well represented by the services and technology that comes together in our portfolio management platform that we call CSC Navigator. So that one place to go where you can see your licenses and when they're coming due, to understand where you're registered with the Secretary of State, when those annual filings are coming due. Again, global services, service of process, litigation management. Again, a centralized platform giving complete visibility to all of those disciplines in one place. So again, it's one thing to talk about challenges, but here we're talking about how can we help, right? What services can we bring to the table? So I specifically have the pleasure now of talking in some detail about the capabilities of a platform that we call CSC Entity Management. And really the best way to think of it is that the CSC Entity Management application lives within Navigator. So I think the first bullet point here is really critical: complete integration with CSC's registered agent services. So to add a little more clarity to that, for organizations that are using CSC as their registered agent or who name CSC to become their registered agent, there are critical core vitals, I'll call them, that we track in that capacity about your subsidiaries. The names of these companies, where they're formed to do business, other jurisdictions where they may also be qualified, dates of registration, statuses within those jurisdictions, and we also have a compliance calendar that gives visibility in terms of when those annual reports and their equivalents are coming due at the Secretary of State level. That information becomes available to all CSC registration customers in our Navigator platform. The reason organizations subscribe to CSC Entity Management is because fundamentally they want to build on top of that core information. They want to be able to do things like track those slates of directors and officers, which again can change fairly dynamically. They want an ability to track ownership information and from that generate graphical or linear org charts. So we talked about that in the life cycle, the idea that we've done a merger or an acquisition and now there's an impact to the ownership structure. Again, the system has automation around the ability to create those visual pictures of the org charts. The platform also has unlimited document storage, and so we talked about the idea that in many of these examples you're going to have to draft documents, consents resolutions potentially for some of these different life cycle events, and the CSC Entity Management platform provides for secure unlimited document storage within the solution. Also, one of the bullet points which I think is of interest to some in the audience is what we're calling integration capabilities. And so we talked about one of these great struggles organizationally is that, I've got my legal team, handling entity responsibilities. I've got another part, maybe it's the tax folks that are dealing with business licenses. I really want to try to bring things together. And so fundamentally, we have a suite of, it's called an API, it stands for Application Program Interface, and not to get too technical, but an API effectively is a technology that lets different systems talk to one another. So maybe to kind of put it into focus, if you have certain information about your companies in our entity platform, maybe the legal entity name, the tax ID number, place of formation, entity type, etc., we effectively can feed that information into other systems within your organization. So if you wanted to share some of that data with a tax system or a finance or accounting system, we absolutely can facilitate the secure exchange of information from our entity system into other sort of internal systems that you're using within your organization to create that greater transparency and sort of cross-departmental sharing of knowledge and information. And then robust reporting. Every single data element within the solution is absolutely reportable. So you can do searches and downloads from the solution, but you can also easily generate reports and even build reports to effectively query the information and pull it out of the solution. So to get into a little bit of detail, and certainly for those who have their appetite grow from this webinar, certainly we're happy to do follow-up and can provide in-depth presentations on all of our solutions. But to give you a little bit of a sense for the technology, the screenshot that you're seeing here is what we call our portfolio grid. So when a user first logs into the entity solution, this is a screen that provides complete visibility to every single entity, every subsidiary that's a part of your portfolio. Active companies, historical entities, certainly could be a mix of global and U.S. companies side by side. You have the ability to search for specific companies. You can also establish what are called favorites. So if you do have a rather large portfolio, you effectively could click a button and focus on a meaningful subset. So maybe I want to focus on a certain country, a certain region, maybe a certain set of acquired entities or legacy companies. There are really an infinite number of ways that you could take this list, which could be rather large, and just boil it down into a smaller group that you can work with. Some of the columns that you're seeing here, where is the entity formed and qualified, and the status, and the entity type, for example. This is a completely configurable application by user. So, for example, if Brian and I were both working within the legal department of an organization, he might have a set of columns that he cares to see that maybe I don't share that same view, right? I might have a different set of vitals that I want to take a look at when I'm working in the solution. And every individual user has the opportunity to add, hide, and rearrange columns as they see fit within the solution itself. The next screenshot that you're seeing here is name history. And this is more than anything just an attempt to sort of have a callback to one of the lifecycle events that we talked about earlier, the idea that you've gone through a name change. And sometimes that's actually in coordination with an acquisition. You might acquire a set of companies and you decide that you want to kind of reconcile the names of those companies to kind of conform to your standards. And so, again, this is a part of the solution where not only can you see the true name of the company, but you've got that historical marker, so to speak, of the prior name or names, plural, the dates that those names were in effect, which all become searchable, reportable information within the solution. What I'd also mention actually about that as we segue into directors, officers, is that if you had CSC actually file the name change for your organization, not only would the new name appear automatically in our technology, but the old name would go right into that historical grid that you saw, and then the supporting document that would come back from the filing registry would automatically be linked to the company in real time as well. And that sort of automated capability of, again, data flowing in, documents flowing in, is not by any means unique to just a name change. Any sort of a corporate filing, whether it's a merger, dissolution, formation, qualification, etc., again, the data documents that come as a result of those transactions flow automatically into our entity management technology. So I've got two more slides on the entity platform, and then I'll kick things over to Brian, who's going to talk a little bit in detail about some of our business license capabilities. But now you're seeing a screenshot of the Officer Director module within the solution. And effectively, this is a view at what we call the entity level, the idea being that you did click on one of those companies from the main screen and then sort of drill down into the Officer Director record of the entity. Quick thing to mention, we use that term Officer Director quite a bit, but really it's much more inclusive. It could be that you're tracking members and managers. Maybe you have global entities where you're tracking powers of attorney or authorized signers. So effectively, what we call the role, or what you might think of as the capacity of that person, could really be anything that you need it to be. The titles are equally as flexible. When a user first navigates to this area, by default, they would be seeing a list of active individuals, but there is also an area where the history can be managed as well. So we have point-in-time capabilities around understanding not just who's active as of this moment, but if I want to look at a historical date or date range, the system absolutely can give you that level of insight as well. In addition to being able to see officers, directors at what we'll call the entity level, again, folks that are appointed to a particular subsidiary, there is also a view at what we call our portfolio level, where you might say, okay, well, I see that Bob Smith is an officer on this company, but show me all the companies where he has that particular position. So the system absolutely can give you that sort of across-the-board holistic perspective of all the appointments that a person would have across all of your subsidiaries. And then the last slide that we have here in terms of screenshots on the system is what we call our good standing calendar. And this is something that I think I alluded to a little bit earlier. This is where really we're bringing knowledge to the equation. We talked about a best practice of being able to have an understanding of what's coming due when, what responsibilities, what obligations do I have. So within the entity solution, we offer what's called a good standing calendar, and it automatically creates events for when there are annual filings, like annual reports as an example, that impact the good standing status of your companies at the Secretary of State level. Not only can it create the events, which again it does in an automated fashion, but it can send reminders to the correct set of individuals as well. So it could be that I want a notification a month before a filing is due, or 2 months out, or even as many as 3 months in advance. The system can be, again, automatically sending you proactive notifications of things that are coming due. Now, we do have some organizations that use CSC Agent that will, again, use the calendar to give them that insight in terms of upcoming annual report obligations. But probably our most popular managed service that we offer as an organization is what we call our annual report preparation and filing service, where effectively an organization is saying, get this off of my plate. I have more sort of high value work that I can do for my organization. So CSC is able to offer really a turnkey solution where CSC becomes responsible for preparing the forms, advancing fees, submitting filings, and really, again, kind of in that turnkey fashion, taking on responsibility from a legal standpoint, from a financial standpoint of maintaining and really guaranteeing your compliance at the Secretary of State level. When CSC is in the role of handling your annual reports, the calendar actually has a status that updates automatically. So not only would it let you know what's coming due, but you would have complete visibility and transparency into where CSC is in the process of completing that filing on your behalf. And as is the case with any transaction that we perform, once we get the documentation back from the filing registry, in this case the annual report document, we again call that the evidence of the filing, we automatically link that to your companies where it's stored in a perpetual fashion. So for our clients that do have CSC take on the responsibility of handling the annual reports, this just becomes, again, kind of a portal, a lens into seeing the work that we're doing for you. You know what's coming due, you know where we are in the process of handling it, and when it is completed, you see the status in the calendar, and you've got the documents to prove it out in the system as well.
Thanks, David. So now I'm going to dive into the industry-specific world of business licenses. Now, I'm sure everybody on the phone has different types of licenses. Some general ones you might run into locally are business tax receipts, privilege taxes, occupational taxes, or simply they might just be called general business licenses. But some of the things that we can help in regards to those, beyond the general, are the industry specific as well. And we can do that through business license research. So the first bullet I have here is called new location research. So if you people on the phone, to go back to the formation or the qualification, or maybe if you're not even looking to register with the Secretary of State office from a nexus perspective, maybe you just want to go into a new market. You're going to have somebody working from home. You're going to have salespeople go door to door in a particular jurisdiction. You're going to drive your company vehicle to Lake Placid. What does a location mean to you? Okay? And once you understand what that is, we have many different questionnaires that are going to be pertinent to your location, to your industry, I should say. And here at CSC, we're going to be able to do a deep dive into the licensing requirements that are pertinent to you. We have a team of about 70 individuals. They're all in-house here. We don't outsource any of this work by any means. We're going to go ahead and identify, based on your activity, are there state-level licensing requirements? Are there federal licensing requirements? Are there unique county, city? If you have a physical address, whether it be a home or maybe a brick-and-mortar location, do you fall potentially inside county lines or inside city limits? Maybe you fall, to go back to the point of 150,000 authorities, maybe some village, township, or boroughs. We can do all that legwork for you. Instead of you having to figure that out, where to start and what applies based on the rules and ordinances, we can do that work for you and lay out that blueprint, so to speak, for that expansion or maybe bidding on an opportunity. For those of you that are on the phone that already have a portfolio of licenses, maybe you're unsure of the clarity, right, or how clear or how confident you are, I should say, with your data. Or maybe you acquire a company, we talked about that acquisition life cycle. We can press the reset button and do what we call existing location research. You provide us with all your locations, or again, the places that you're doing business, and we're going to come back and really tell you a handful of things. We're going to tell you what's required and do you have it. We're going to make sure it's active and good standing. If you're missing anything, we're going to let you know it's something that needs to be fulfilled. But the other level of service that it's going to provide is it's going to let you potentially know what you have over-licensed. Maybe you filed something unnecessarily, and it can allow you to mitigate costs and have just unnecessary licenses throughout the country. And the reason that's important is because, again, we're talking about 150,000 jurisdictions. A law in one particular jurisdiction could completely change within 6 months. So this is a way to literally, again, the phrase I use is pressing the reset button. The other type of research we offer is called amendment research, and this goes back to what David was talking about, officer ownership changes or maybe name changes. This is our way of identifying, what are the requirements to trickle down that change. Is it something simple as maybe we identify company letterhead signed by an officer, or maybe there is official new application or transfer. We can work on that. So that's going to be the research way that we can help. But beyond that, we can help you physically manage the licenses. We would take all your data, all your licenses, or maybe we did that existing research to start or new locations if you're a brand new company, and we're going to give you visibility into all of your licenses. And I'll show you a screenshot of this in a second. But we're going to give you a dedicated point of contact. This individual is going to be your partner in crime. We're going to identify, let you know what we're working on 60 days in advance. We're going to cut all the checks, so you're not going to have to go through approvals through multiple departments, maybe based on the amount of the check. You're not going to have to provide any retainers or escrow funds on our behalf. We are not only going to cut the checks and pay and submit everything, we're going to do all the red tape follow-up. So if you're going to open a location and you need something immediately, you don't need to worry about the stress that comes with calling the governing body every day, knowing they're only open 5 hours, 3 days a week. Let us do all that pain for you. We're going to do the follow-ups. We're going to maintain the portfolio. We're going to store your active and historical images of all these licenses. And then for those of you that have multiple locations, we're more than happy at no additional cost to send those originals directly to your locations with posting instructions. And as I promised you, I will show you, for those of you, so you can see on the phone, once we have your licenses in your portfolio, you can just understand and see who holds the license, the entity or individual that is. You can see the jurisdiction, the expiration dates, the file numbers. All of these, again, local industry-specific licenses will be housed in CSC Navigator, for your viewing pleasure, to really have, again, that security, transparency, and centralization as to what we're doing for you.